never slow up. No, I don't take shit, I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up.
The Mastermind. Channel NARRA Episode 7. Alright. Mastermind. First, we'll briefly review what happened, and then we'll get into today's story. We started the Mastermind saga in the Philippines, where 2 women were murdered and no one really knew why. The main character, for whom Hunter works or worked, is someone named Paul Roux, who is the mastermind and the brains behind this story. Roux is currently in U.S. police custody and has cooperated with U.S. police to apprehend Joseph Hunter, arrest the hitman who worked for Hunter on various projects, and detain several other people who previously worked for Roux directly or indirectly. He became involved in tribal wars in Somalia. He fell into a trap set for him, pursuing a very lucrative drug deal in Liberia, where he was arrested. On the way to New York, he said he was willing to cooperate with the police to apprehend the people who worked for him. Then, he became involved in this long-term and meticulous sting operation with the U.S. police. We saw that he armed a tribe in Somalia with weapons he smuggled to them from Hong Kong and delivered them. Some say he wanted to occupy Mali. But the reality is, it was, and all news about him was out of reach, and nothing about him existed anywhere. His name had come out because the New York Times had published it, and everyone now knew. But the entire case was classified. Likewise, a large part of the interrogations of Hunter and the terror team Hunter had formed, and the people involved in the crystal meth purchase from North Korea, a large part of those interrogations were also classified. We later heard that most of those cases were closed with the defendants' confessions, and their sentences were eased. We'll hear what happened to the rest of them now. The important point is that all those cases ended up in a way that didn't require a trial where Roux would have to testify. The writer Ratliff says that as these people were one by one accepting their charges and making deals with the police, he was slowly becoming sure that he would never see Roux in any court. Although the police's goal was this, the situation didn't actually turn out that way. In December 2013, a Brazilian newspaper wrote a report saying that Paul Roux had been arrested. December 2013, meaning in the middle of the sting operation for Hunter and the others. The luck the police had was that this report was written in Portuguese and didn't reach the relevant people. It was a year later that the New York Times realized this person was behind the sting operation for Hunter and mentioned his name, when the police's work with him, as far as we know, was finished. We saw that as his money grew, his power increased, his plans became more ambitious, and his greed for illegal activities grew. What is Roux' situation? What is Roux' future? And what's next? Much of the information related to the case is classified. Only legal authorities know Roux' location, his lawyers' names, and some internal information. Of course, some of this secrecy is understandable. From 2012, when this person was arrested, until 2014, he worked as a police infiltrator within his own organization, acting as an informant. Through email and phone, he convinced his people that he was free and operating normally, directing operations. Therefore, it's reasonable to say that everything had to be confidential. In the end, as we heard before, he successfully led his people into a trap that was meticulously designed and executed. Channel NARRA, Part 12, Episode 7. Awaiting the U.S. government's next move. The nature of their killings was strange and somewhat brutal. It wasn't like other murders in the Philippines. Later, we saw that the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration pursued this case in the Philippines. We heard that 2 simulated murder projects were being arranged, 2 fake assassination projects, one to kill a police officer and another to kill an informant. Simultaneously, we saw that he had put other people to work, planning to buy a high-quality crystal meth shipment from North Korea and bring it to New York. Some people were also involved in that case. Finally, All these people and those hitmen, and other people who worked for him in various parts of the world, were arrested. Eventually, we discovered that a person named Joseph Hunter, who was arrested in Phuket, Thailand on other charges, was connected to these murders. What gradually became clear was that Hunter isn't the main character in the story. Then we saw that for years, Roux ran a successful online business selling pharmaceuticals in the US. It was a business he started himself, wrote the back-end program for, and had companies worldwide managing its daily operations. We also saw that this person wasn't always like this. In his youth, he was a computer nerd who loved programming and quickly pursued learning how to code. As he got older in his youth, he was a person with very respectable and defensible concerns about privacy. He worried that user privacy was being lost at a time when no one else was worried about such things. In the early 2000s, he wrote a software called E4M that helps personal users encrypt their hard drives. He said that everyone should do this, that we should protect our information, and so on. We saw that he was also a skilled person. He demonstrated his expertise in online forums. The report's author interviewed people who worked with him during that period, and they all testified that he was a very proficient programmer. The same program he wrote for his pharmaceutical company, which worked almost flawlessly, shows what a clean, organized, and sharp mind he had. They delivered medicine from American pharmacies to American customers with American prescriptions, without anyone involved ever meeting in person. Everything was online. This business, parts of which were illegal, made him very rich and powerful. During this time, he lived in the Philippines. Later, we saw that he got involved in other activities. Then, gradually, we saw what different paths he took. Dealings in precious metals in Africa, gold smuggling, exploitation of rare forest resources in Africa, and a series of other very strange dealings in Africa. Ultimately, when it seemed he had permanently escaped the police grasp and was living in a very safe place, this same greed got him into trouble. We also heard about these sting operations. Now in this part, let's see what happened after they were arrested, what the legal status of their cases is, and what's going on now. Since Roux' arrest, the government has been extraordinarily protective of him. However, after that, there's little justification for why everything related to this person should be classified. But the secrecy regarding Roux continued even after this. The logic, however, had changed this time. In late 2015, 2 American lawyers pulled a trick to bring Roux into the spotlight. These were the lawyers for Moran Azoulay, an Israeli. We previously mentioned that he managed one of Roux' call centers in Jerusalem. Later, he also became the manager of one of the call centers in Tel Aviv, and had become an important person in that branch of Paul Roux' business. This is actually their last attempt to keep Roux hidden from public view. Ratliff still says, "We reached the courthouse and I went and sat at the back of the hall next to a few local reporters and Moran Azoulay's wife. Azoulay was brought in. He had a neatly trimmed beard, wore a kippah on his head, one of those hats that Jews generally wear on their heads." Ratliff has made a great effort to understand why there is so much secrecy in Roux' case from the government. The story of the U.S. government's relationship with Paul Roux began in September 2012, when on a charter plane flying from Liberia to New York, bringing Paul Roux, Paul tells them he wants to cooperate. A few hours after arriving in New York, he is given a public defender who is later replaced. Ratliff's sources in the police say that Roux was in New York City under the control of the D, and they were the ones who put him to work. And from that very day, Ratliff was able to piece together some information and tell us a little about how this operation was planned. What Ratliff understood is that Roux is a prisoner. When they need to make a call, for example, it has to be at night because of the time difference, and they get permission from the prison for him to stay out at night. Also, as one of the people who was in Roux's meetings with the D says, he cooperated very eagerly. He clearly considered himself the smartest person in the meeting room. He would also sprinkle in some playful humor during the work, and he was also careful to move things along in a way that he would not have to spend the rest of his life behind bars. He worked with open eyes, organizing the fake South American deal and the astonishing and irresistible offer that was later sent to Joseph Hunter and his people. Then, as we heard in one of the episodes, his email was mirrored onto a Gmail account held by the D, and they could not only see all his emails themselves, but also communicate with various people on behalf of Roux. Ratliff also says, I once called the liar to get some information, and he said, yes, I worked on the case for a while, and then I didn't anymore. I don't have any more information to give, or I won't give it. He didn't say anything else. He wore a black jacket, long-leg jeans that covered his ankle monitor. What's in this case? Roux has 2 indictments. One is in New York for conspiracy to import crystal meth into the U.S. This is related to that fake deal that eventually led to his capture in Liberia and his arrest. His second indictment is in Minneapolis. There, he is also accused of violating drug trafficking laws. He also has some charges called wire fraud, meaning financial charges in which telecommunication tools and IT were used as tools of the crime, and he is also accused of money laundering. This second indictment is entirely related to the company RX Limited, the online drug sales company whose story we heard in previous episodes and understood how it made Roux wealthy. He wears this monitor because it's part of his release conditions, due to, for example, not being allowed to leave the state limits and so on. When you sign such an agreement, it means you can confess to some wrongdoings and crimes without being prosecuted for them later. In fact, this means they cannot later charge Roux with any other crime he confesses to there. In exchange for such responsibility, he says, I will not only tell you everything I know, but I will also help you arrest my people, like Joseph Hunter and Marana Zule and others. In the U.S., a case has been filed against Zule, and he has been accused of charges related to drug trafficking and also some financial charges for money transfer. They have been here for a year and a half, and during this time, the city's Jewish community has been very supportive of them, providing them with many facilities. They were given an apartment to live in, a car, and on that day, some of them came to court to support Zule. Zule himself also seems lively, and there is no sign on his face that he is about to see someone who was once his boss and at one point threatened him with death and ultimately tricked him and drew him into the police trap. Zule goes up to the front and sits at the plaintiff's table next to his lawyers. A little further away, the prosecutor's representative is sitting. He has a total of 83 counts of charges. Mr. Zule, do you still wish to exercise your legal right to a public hearing? It's not a court, it's a hearing. He says, do you want to exercise your legal right for the hearing to be public? The lawyer says, yes, Your Honor. I don't understand why such a request should be made at all. Roux was a government informant. His name is now public. Everyone knows. The public wants to know what's going on. Right now, media representatives are in court. Mr. Azule's family is in court. They are sitting in the front row, and I don't understand the logic of this request. Usually, it's the government that wants to make such hearings confidential, not the lawyer of an individual. This person's identity has been revealed for some time now, and so far, there has been no danger to his family. Meanwhile, the government has already done some things to protect his family. We don't know exactly what they have done, but the lawyer says this in court. Ratliff also says that this was new information. He had never heard anyone say that the U.S. government was protecting Roux's family. That's why his ears perked up when they said it. Part of this case is based on a series of conversations and emails exchanged between Roux and Zule, many of which Azule's lawyers claim took place when Roux was in custody. The lawyers say, yes, at that time Roux was in police custody under police command, but Azule thought he was free and he was tricked this way. They sat down and thought, what can we do to bring Roux into the spotlight? They personally brought some documents and evidence. Some of these calls were recorded without a judicial warrant. Then they went and protested that these should be removed from the case because, according to the law, at least one party to the conversation must have given permission to record when you are recording without a judicial warrant. Azule didn't give permission. The D claims that Roux gave this permission. These lawyers also say, we don't accept your word. He himself must come to court and testify. They use this trick to be able to see Roux and bring him forward. The court finally accepts, and the government is obligated to bring Roux to testify. One of the people who is naturally very happy about this news is Ratliff. He says, after years of pursuing Roux's shadow first online and on the internet, and then in the Philippines, Israel, Africa, Australia, America, and every corner of the world, I now have the chance to see him up close. On the day of the trial, he goes to Minneapolis, where this case was filed and where this court is scheduled to be held. He says, I was walking in the morning towards the courthouse when I saw these two lawyers for Azule on the way. They showed each other a paper that showed how much the government was still determined to act cautiously and secretly about Roux. The paper was a fake arrest warrant for Roux for cocaine smuggling. In reality, with this warrant, they fabricated a fake arrest warrant, a simulated warrant in the police department under the guise of which they could bring these police officers into the city and bring Roux, who was being held in New York here without his records later being traceable for what purpose he came. Roux's lawyers, claiming that an open court would tear Roux's family apart and cause damage and so on, requested that the court be confidential. His wife and two children, after a long struggle with the U.S. Immigration Department, were finally allowed to come to the U.S. from Israel. Then the judge opens the session by saying, yes, we have received a request from one of the lawyers to make the court private. As the judge considers his opinion on Roux's lawyer's request, Ratliff is thinking that the decision the judge is about to make will determine whether he will ever see Paul Roux up close or not. Well, now let's see what Roux's case, whose story we've heard so far, is about when it comes to the legal case. On the very day Paul Roux arrived in New York in September 2012, he signed an agreement with the police called a proffer agreement. Throughout these years of cooperation, there are only a handful of people who know Paul Roux's exact location. One of the places where Roux was held, one of these detention centers, was a bit careless in classifying his documents. Most of 2013 was spent on detailed and extensive planning for those two fake operations. One to ensnare Joseph Hunter and his terror team, and the other to buy crystal meth from North Korea for the New York market. Both operations had to be designed well enough and be attractive enough to persuade the targets to come towards the bait. And they also had to not be so good that anyone would doubt the authenticity of the matter. Therefore, the work was a bit precise. Besides these, there were also operations related to the RX Limited case. There were rumors in the organization that he might have gone to Australia. He says, how can we hire bodyguards and protection? And they want to take him to the police station for questioning. The bodyguards, seeing that things were bad, put their tails between their legs and ran away. The police officers tell Raphael and their Romanian friend, you also come with us to the police station. We have a few questions for you there. The case of Azule and his colleagues in RX Limited goes to Minnesota. It was emphasized to them that the drugs they were smuggling were going to be sold in New York so that the New York police could later prosecute their case and press charges against them. In January 2015, he requested the judge to dismiss the charges against this person because he was forced into these actions, but Roux's relative, who spoke extensively with Ratliff, and knows him very well from childhood and later worked with him in the organization, says that Hunter's words about these threats are true. During the gold deal in Mali, he really threatened to kill him and his family. But the government says that the threats are very old, and now the situation was not such that Hunter couldn't quit his job or even go to the police. A few weeks later, without the judge responding to Hunter's lawyer's request, Hunter accepted his charges. Over the next year and a half, similar things happened to the rest of Hunter's co-defendants. 2 of them confessed to conspiring to assassinate a police officer and received 20-year sentences. Falter received an 8-year sentence just for guarding the plane carrying cocaine, and Sibursky is still waiting for his sentence to be announced. Adrian Walvick, who commanded the field operations for the crystal meth shipment, received a little over 9 years. Peralta, the bartender who became LaRue's and Chiung Tang Lim's Chinese intermediary, received 7.5 years. The rest, meaning Astamers, Philip Schock, and Lim, have not yet been sentenced. They are awaiting their sentences. And the only reason Hunter cooperated with Paul LaRue was that if he didn't, he would have been killed. Hunter said that years ago, over a gold deal in Mali, LaRue threatened to kill him and his family. Then this lawyer writes that this Mr. X had previously murdered some of his colleagues, and a number of their former colleagues are fully aware of this matter. It is astonishing to us how law enforcement uses such a person to set a trap for someone who had previously threatened to kill him. Then he says that Hunter had no other choice. He either had to choose to cooperate with them or he and his family would be killed. As much as possible, their meetings with these people were recorded so that nothing could be denied. And the assassination plot was allowed to proceed almost to completion to show that the defendants were truly ready and determined to go all the way. 5 of the defendants, those who were supposed to buy a shipment of crystal meth from North Korea for the Colombian cartel and then sell it in New York, are tried in the Southern District of New York. There is also another group, a third group, whose case also comes to New York, but it goes to a different district. And in this group is Joseph Hunter, who, as we heard before, was arrested in Phuket, Thailand, and quickly transferred to New York. And the people who were in the terror team that Hunter had formed, Dennis Gukir and Timothy Van Wakius, who were arrested in Liberia and were preparing to kill that person, and 2 others, Slavomir Sibursky and Michael Falter, who were arrested in Austria. Then they put everyone in a private car with private license plates, an old car, and in the car, Azule, terrified, turns to his friends and tells them, "Look, they don't even have police uniforms. We're done for." Raphael says that Azule was clearly worried that this boss would cause him trouble. Their local friend goes and finds a Romanian lawyer for Azule. Raphael quickly goes to the hotel to get the passports, and they are very optimistic that the whole matter is a misunderstanding until it's evening and they go on with their lives. But later, when he returns to the police station, they tell him, "Sir, we have arrested your friend on behalf of an American organization." And then it turns out that the only woman who was among the plainclothes police officers surrounding Azule at the hotel was none other than Kimberly, a D officer who is the mastermind behind the 7 years of investigations that the D has been conducting into the RX Limited case. Finally, with the help of the local friend, they hire 2 tough bodyguards by the hour. Go to Azule as parents and tell them to find a good lawyer, because your friend is being taken to America to be prosecuted. Moran Azule is one of LaRue's last employees who falls into his trap and is brought to America. Over 3 years, a total of 12 other people were arrested with Azule through LaRue's hidden plans. 7 others were arrested without LaRue's help or involvement, like those pharmacists and doctors who were in America, and so on. LaRue had set the meeting in a hotel far from the airport. Azule and his friends arrive there in the morning, trying to get there earlier than others. He sends the bodyguards to a corner of the lobby so they won't be seen. Raphael and his Romanian friend stay outside by the door, and Azule goes into the lobby alone and sits down. After half an hour, he texts Raphael that the gentleman still hasn't arrived. A little later, when Raphael replies and asks him something, there is no further reply from Azule. They get worried and go inside to look for him. Some said he might have gone to Brazil, and one of his former managers, as we heard at the end of one of the episodes, said that we knew something had happened, but we didn't know what, and we were praying that he was dead. At the same time, Azule calls Sean Rowan, an Israeli who worked for Paul in the Philippines, and tries to get information from him about LaRue's whereabouts, and he tells him that the boss has gone underground and is hiding. At this time, Azule is building a house for himself in Jerusalem. He also opens a sandwich shop with his friends in Tel Aviv, but as we said, he also feels responsible for his creditors. Most of them are people who don't even know anyone named Paul LaRue. Their contact person has always been Azule. They keep calling him saying, "Sir, you closed the company, we lost our jobs. According to the law, you must pay us so much." That's why when LaRue reappears in 2013, Azule is very happy. They talk a little sporadically, and then in 2014, he calls him and says, "The money is ready. You just need to come and see each other one more time, and then I'll send you the money." They make an appointment to meet in Romania. Azule calls one of his friends named Raphael and tells him, "Come, let's go to Bucharest, Romania." They also had a friend there whom they would visit sometimes. They go there and spend 2 or 3 days wandering around and gambling a little. And Azule wins several thousand euros at roulette, which was his favorite game, and drug sales and so on, but their priority was lower than these. But finally, they decide to go after the people in that case as well, and in the same year, 2013, LaRue also contacts Azule and sets the trap for Moran Azule as well. At this time, 4 years have passed since the incident where Moran Azule was thrown into the water and struggled in front of Davy Smith, an incident we described in a previous episode that led Azule to want to cut off his cooperation with LaRue, but he eventually decided to stay in the organization for his own life's sake. Now Azule has slowly freed himself from the thoughts and worries related to his strange work in online drug trafficking. 2 years before this, LaRue told him to close the companies, lay off people, sell the office from the ground up, and send him some money to pay a portion of the employees' claims. Azule had now abandoned that life and those thoughts and everything else, and was almost not thinking about it anymore. Why do we say almost? Because every now and then he would still email LaRue asking, "Sir, we need to pay the claims of these employees we laid off. Their accounts are still not settled." And at the time they were closing the company, LaRue had sent 2 or 3 times the amount of money that, according to Israeli law, they should pay these employees. He had finally given it, but the rest remained unpaid. Azule felt a sense of responsibility in the middle of all this. He was upset partly because many of these people were his friends, who had come to work in this company on his word and had claims against him, and he couldn't pay their claims. Until September 2012, as we said, LaRue disappeared. Then, as the day of the meeting approaches, Azule gradually becomes worried about his Romanian friend. The hotel has another entrance. At the door of that other entrance is Azule, surrounded by some people whom Azule says are plainclothes police officers. So, when they arrive at the police station, they feel a little relieved. The Romanian lawyer also tells Raphael, "You also pack up and go to Israel." From here, the prosecutions are divided into 3 groups. The cases against them were also meticulously prepared. Joseph Hunter's public defender hoped to find a pretext for defending his client from Paul LaRue, as in Hunter's history. The government, of course, says that this claim is not true. Hong Kong, which was once home to LaRue's organization's financial operations, has also prosecuted some of these Israelis. Schulman, who managed these gold hoards and gold reserves, pleaded guilty to 2 charges and received a 5-year sentence. Gavish and several other Israelis said, "We didn't know anything. We didn't even know where the gold came from," and so on. But they were also prosecuted for similar crimes as Schulman and received a total of 4 or 5 years in prison. Of course, but the part that was made public was, what did the government really gain from this whole affair? The D arrested an international criminal they had been pursuing for years and had put a bounty on him. We also heard his story. The U.S. government still tries to meticulously protect information related to this person and be careful not to let much out. Justice Department officials also say that they have no comment and cannot comment because the case is still ongoing, and so on. All of this has led many people to think that something bigger is going on here. That online drug sales company and arrest their managers, including these Israelis who were in Israel, and most importantly, contact Marana Zule. LaRue says, "Sir, the money I owed you and you owed your former employees there is ready. I'll see you in Romania, and then I'll give you the money." So he gets up and goes to Romania. He himself is a little suspicious at first, but there, he is finally arrested and then brought to America. There is something more important than this sting operation behind all this secrecy and hidden activity. The RX Limited case is in Minneapolis. The other interesting point we learned was that Hunter and the other people who were in that case almost all confessed and received sentences that are not very heavy. And now they are waiting for their prison terms to begin, or some are still waiting for sentencing during their prison term. Most of those who were in the crystal meth smuggling case are also waiting for sentencing. But overall, the sentences that have been given so far are not very heavy. A group of people were also convicted in Hong Kong, most of whom were these Israelis. They also received 4-year and 5-year sentences, and finally some received 8-year and 9-year sentences. Some of these Israelis, as we said, were able to escape somehow and went to Israel and returned home. Then they spent several more years and a lot of resources and money to arrest a few of this person as subordinates. In this part, in the last part of the Mastermind podcast series, and then let's go to the last part of the last episode of the story. He confesses to a series of crimes there, which we will now say what they are, and in return, what he gives to the government is that he gives them his information about all the operations he had carried out until then and the people he knew, and he also helps them arrest his subordinates. We had heard about 2 of these plans before, to fake deals, 2 sting operations. One for smuggling crystal meth from North Korea to New York. Some people were involved in that incident. Some people were also involved in the case of assassinating 2 imaginary people, 2 fictional characters, an American police officer and an informant. In this story, we heard that, yes, the government has tried very hard to protect information related to LaRue and has tried as much as possible not to bring this person into the public eye. However, 2 American lawyers who were the lawyers for Marana Zule, the Israeli, manager of LaRue's call center in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, these lawyers used a trick to bring LaRue into the spotlight as a witness in a minor case. They had filed a minor request whose original request was not very important. The important thing for them was to be able to bring LaRue in front of people, in the public eye, and ask him a few questions, and let the world know who this person is and what his importance is. As a result of this assistance, they received 3 people, 2 of whom are former American military personnel and are ready to assassinate an American police officer, and they gave them 8 more people who were willing and eager to smuggle drugs into America. These are all their achievements. But the D knows that Paul LaRue personally ordered the killing of at least 6 or 7 people. They know that he is the mastermind, the brains behind operations that are several times larger and more complex than the work these clumsy underlings were trying to do. Was this achievement really worth these costs? However, among these Israelis, At least 2 of them were released from Hong Kong prison before their sentence with the mediation of someone who refused to speak to Ratliff and returned to Israel. We know that D agents, a few months after Hunter's confession, went to the Philippines. There, they investigated the murder case and gathered information that ultimately led to the arrest of 2 Americans whom Hunter had hired for this assassination. And as we said, he was dissatisfied with the quality of their work and their speed. These 2 are now arrested. These 2 are now in prison and awaiting sentencing. But the person who paid these 2 people $35,000 for the assassination of Catherine Lee was Paul Roux. The person who planned the operation and provided them with weapons and facilities was Hunter. Now, neither Roux nor Hunter have any charges related to this murder in their cases. The lawyers for those hitmen say that there is not even much hope of being able to summon Roux and Hunter as witnesses in those cases. These 2 had no connection to that incident at all. But these mercenaries who went and killed them will most likely be tried for capital punishment. Joseph Hunter was still awaiting sentencing at the time the last part of Evan Ratliff's report was published. And Ratliff had written that he could receive a life sentence for each of these murders and drug crimes he confessed to. After the first part of our podcast was broadcast, news spread showing that Hunter's sentence had been announced. We explained the whole thing in a post on the channel NARRA podcast blog. You can read it all there. But the summary is that Hunter's defense had 2 bases. First, that the defendant carried out his orders out of fear that his boss would kill him, and second, that Hunter suffered from PTSD due to his military service and participation in the Iraq War and some other classified operations he is unable to name. This is something very common among veterans, among those who return from war, and so on. And this strengthened his sense of fear and made Roux's threats even more effective. In short, the lawyer also uses this background. Then he says that Mr. Roux has money, many influential acquaintances all over the world, and most importantly, he knows where Hunter lives and can reach him. That's why Hunter was afraid and, as a result, carried out his orders. In the same blog post, we explained that, of course, the prosecutor, in response, says that, firstly, Hunter had previously left Roux's employ once and later returned for a higher salary, which shows that quitting his job was not impossible. And also, he had previously refused to do certain tasks without any consequences. Regarding PTSD, they said, now we will allow his claims to be examined, and so on. But there are many people who have PTSD, but they don't go around killing people. Meanwhile, there is no causal relationship between having PTSD and the detailed planning and complex designs that this person was making to kill various people. In the end, in summary, the judge accepts the prosecutor's explanations and the defense's explanations, but says that given this person's military background and the fact that he accepted responsibility, and given that he is 51 years old, he will not give him more than a 20-year sentence. Now let's return to Evan Ratliff's report. He says that the question that came to his mind after seeing all the police achievements from their cooperation with Roux, not all of them, one of the most astonishing things here is probably the story of the brutal murder of Catherine Lee, the Filipino real estate agent whose story we heard in the first episode of Mastermind. Even though Roux's name is now in the news and many people around the world know his story, for example. Well, let's briefly review what we've said so far. Next, we heard about the agreement Roux made, and we understood that when Roux was arrested, he signed an agreement with the government that allows him to confess to some sins and crimes there, and then the government is not allowed to prosecute him for the crimes he confessed to there. The story we hadn't heard before was that they later decided that since Roux was here, and they could also go after the RX Limited case. As we said, those 2 cases are being pursued in New York. The RX Limited case is in Minneapolis. The other interesting point we learned was that Hunter and the other people who were in That case almost all confessed and received sentences that are not very heavy. The fact that the government only managed to gain this, that it was able to arrest some of LaRoux's subordinates with his help. LaRoux himself, with his current case, his background, and his importance, is much more significant than, for example, becoming bait for the arrest of Joseph Hunter and these people we mentioned who were arrested all over the world. That's why many people doubt this scenario and say that perhaps there is something else at play. Previously, in one of the episodes, we talked about Paul LaRoux's background in encryption. We said he wrote a software called E4M for encrypting hard drives. And then we said that based on this code, another free and open source software called TrueCrypt emerged, and it was never known who was behind it. But we heard from Edward Snowden that the NSA had been trying to break this software for years and had not succeeded in infiltrating it. It is also important software. Snowden himself highly recommended using it. Many journalists use it, many people use it, and so on. In 2014, the unknown developers behind the TrueCrypt software suddenly announced that the program was no longer secure. Experts were bewildered as to why, what had happened, and so on. Ratliff suspected that this might have something to do with LaRoux's arrest. Perhaps LaRoux helped the government infiltrate the code, and that's why the owners of the matter realized that the code had been broken and, for example, gave this warning. When one's mind is looking for what kind of behind-the-scenes deal there might be, this is finally one of the things that comes to mind and may be real. LaRoux, in August 2013, dismissed the lawyer who was under pressure and hired another one. And now they are waiting for their prison terms to begin, or some are still waiting for sentencing during their prison term. Most of those who were in the crystal meth smuggling case are also waiting for sentencing. But overall, the sentences that have been given so far are not very heavy. A group of people were also convicted in Hong Kong, most of whom were these Israelis. They also received 4-year and 5-year sentences, and finally some received 8-year and 9-year sentences. Some of these Israelis, as we said, were able to escape somehow and went to Israel and returned home. Now we have reached the point where this whole matter doesn't really make sense. For some time, he apologizes for this too and hires a third lawyer. No one knows the name of this third lawyer, and his name is completely confidential. That is, he says the opposite is more logical. I would have gladly cooperated with them if they had come to me. Then he recounts the story of his struggling in the water next to the boat. 2 of them are Oz's colleagues in India, who are in Israel and are still free. One of these pharmacists was a businessman from Detroit named Babu Bhai Patel, who, by chance, was convicted a while later in another case, also about drug fraud, but completely unrelated to Arcs Limited. They think it's a good story and can be used to argue that he worked with LaRoux due to previous threats and out of fear, similar to the claim made by Hunter's lawyers. But their main problem is how to bring LaRoux to court. Richmond says that the government doesn't want this person to appear in court because, I think the government is ashamed that it used such a person as an informant and cooperated with him. They don't want to confess that LaRoux helped them. This is when, as we said, Richmond uses the tactic of objecting to unauthorized recordings, saying, for example, that if the government wants to prove that LaRoux allowed the recordings, they must bring him to court, and he must swear and testify under oath, and so on. These 2 lawyers, Richmond and Friedberg, Oz's lawyers, as we said, are actually defending the only important person in this case who has decided to defend himself. This is how we return to where we started this episode. In early March, Evan Ratliff, the author of the Mastermind report, is sitting in the courtroom next to local reporters, and Moran Oz's wife, anxious to see whether the judge will agree to LaRoux's or LaRoux's lawyers, or LaRoux's lawyer's last-minute request and make the court private at their request, or whether this person will finally be able to see LaRoux up close. The request is not accepted. The judge says there is no sufficient reason against Moran Oz S. and his lawyers' strong desire to make the court public, and therefore LaRue's lawyer's request for a private court is rejected and the trial begins. First, Linda Marks, representing the government, calls 2 D agents. They come and give some testimony about LaRue's arrest. Then the judge turns to Richmond. He says, "Your Honor, LaRue enters the courtroom through a side door escorted by 2 plainclothes marshals with a somewhat frizzy beard, a lemon T-shirt plainclothes marshals, and as he goes to lean on a leather chair, he eagerly surveys the courtroom." Ratliff says, "My gaze locked on him for a moment, but he quickly turned his head without showing any emotion in his gaze and looked at everyone. Oz accepted some things. He said, 'Yes, I managed that Israeli company. I knew that this company belonged to the Arcs Limited Group, which sold several million drugs and defrauded tens of millions of dollars. My email address is in many of the emails in the case file.' But Oz says that, firstly, he was told and he thought that all the activities of this company were legal. And secondly, his email was not a personal email. Many people in the office had his email and used that email for company work. It was actually the office email. One of them is someone the Philippine police arrested and is awaiting extradition to America. One is an Israeli named Omer Bezalel who handled the logistics for the company, Arcs Limited, and almost simultaneously with Oz. He was also taken to Romania and then brought to America for 2 cents. Then he was released on bail, went to a temporary prison, and from there, it seems he escaped and probably left America, and no one has heard from him much since. There is another one named Jonathan Wall. He has also confessed. He is an Israeli-American who is the manager of one of LaRue's call centers in the Philippines. Later, he was arrested in Kentucky, in America, of course. He had come to America several years before and was supplying equipment for LaRue from here, literally buying whatever they wanted for him. Cars, computer servers, diving equipment, personal planes, anything. And under a hail of bullets and says, "You are coming after me. I am broken myself." Everywhere I go, I imagine people are like this. But in the end, all his efforts are fruitless, and as we said, they send him to America, to Minneapolis. His family, with the help of Jewish people in Minneapolis, hires 2 well-known lawyers from Israel, the same ones who, as we mentioned, used the tactic of eventually bringing LaRue to the scene. Ratliff naturally goes to see these lawyers. They are, in fact, the representatives of the only important defendant in this case who has decided to defend himself. This is an unprecedented case, even for famous terrorists. We haven't had such a thing before. He is also a cheerful and pleasant person, and his presence probably helped him greatly in his success in several high-profile criminal cases he had previously worked on in the city. The other is a man named Richmond, a reserved and calm person with neat gray hair parted on the side. He has a polite, somewhat forced smile, and this is the person who has done most of the heavy work on this case. He says that this case is an extraordinarily massive case in terms of volume. There are tens of millions of pages of documents in this case. We have to deal with a lot of internet and phone connection networks and bank accounts and these things that are all connected and intertwined. Of course, he is telling Ratliff, who already knows these things because he has done this work himself. As lawyer Moran Oz says, it's ridiculous that the accused name is known to everyone and publicized, but his lawyer's name remains confidential. Moran Oz, an Israeli, spent the first 2 months after his arrest in a prison where one of his cellmates had a stroke and died. His conditions were not very good, according to him. Afterward, his family hired a Romanian lawyer, for example, to prevent his extradition. All those sessions, of course, were held in Romanian, and Oz didn't understand much of what was going on. He only understood that in the end, all their efforts led nowhere, and they said, "We shouldn't send you to New York." What was strange for Oz and probably interesting for many of us, is at least why the US government used LaRue to trap Oz. One of them is a man named Friedberg, a talkative man with a large double chin, soft, thin, light brown hair. Besides Oz, other people whose names have been requested are also involved. In these arrests, 3 doctors were also arrested, physicians who wrote prescriptions for this company, and 2 pharmacists. Then he tells the lawyers about the boat incident, the shooting, and Davis Mito, saying that he was threatened and so on. Then, on January 15th, the judge announces his ruling, confirming that, yes, this request they made to summon Paul is approved. LaRue's lawyer, whose presence is not clear, and we don't know if he was in court that day, so the government's representative effectively does what his lawyer should do in introducing him. This makes the scene even stranger than it already is, as if this person is a government agent. Richmond, Oz's lawyer, comes out from behind the table, walks to the stand, and begins questioning. LaRue says that in his agreement with the government, they gave no guarantee. He says, yes, that's correct. LaRue says, I don't know the laws here, so I can't answer that question. If you say it's like that ... The very fact that he was able to bring him as a witness in Oz Hess trial shows that, in fact, the story of this man's criminal and bloody life will come out after this trial. Probably, the news will not be published anywhere else in Persian, just as the story of LaRue himself, despite all its importance and magnitude, as far as I know, has not been told anywhere in Persian until now. But there was another piece of news in LaRue's testimony. I myself had not read the last paragraphs of this last part of the Mastermind report until now and had saved it, to preserve the excitement of knowing the end of the story for myself and to understand it, for example, at the time of recording. This part, now that I look at it, becomes even more interesting for us. In a part of the ceremony where the government representative is reading the list of crimes that LaRue himself has confessed to, there is a case that is completely new and rivets everyone. LaRue confesses to selling technology to Iran. The main text of the charges is put on the channel NARRA podcast blog. The full file can be seen there. But then he decides to try another tactic, to take another step. He says, "Is it true that they say you kill people who steal from you?" He says, "That's an exaggeration. Richmond's work is done." Then the government representative comes and asks a question or two about whether LaRue had given permission to the government to record his conversations. He says yes. Then the same 2 marshals come and escort him out through the same side door. Outside the courtroom, Friedberg looks very victorious, although in the end, the recordings and conversations come into the case, and their request to remove them is rejected. But their goal was not this. He himself says, "It's clear that request would be rejected, but it doesn't matter at all. That issue was just an excuse for us to be able to bring LaRue into public view." Now they still plan to summon LaRue as a witness in Oz's trial. Here he talks about US laws, but when it comes to punishment and laws in other countries, he claims to have a very good grasp of the laws, and it seems he is right. For example, he says, "I know that in the Philippines and in Ecuador, where the crystal meth shipment originated and I can be tried there, they can try me. But Brazil has no laws for conspiracy and complicity, so I haven't committed a crime there, and that's why I can't be tried there." Or, for example, about his adventures in Somalia, he says, "If Brazil has no law for conspiracy and complicity, Somalia has no government at all. So there is no possibility of being prosecuted there at all." And for example, "You ordered the murder of a Filipino customs officer, right?" "No, that's not correct." "What's not correct?" "That person was not a customs officer." "Well, he was a real estate broker, right?" "Yes. And then there was another real estate broker, right?" "Yes, that's correct. Who was also killed at your command, right?" "Yes, that's correct." "And you know that there are 2 people Mr. Sami and Mr. Steelville, who are being interrogated for one of those murders, right? Yes, that's correct. And you know that if you were tried in that case, you might have been sentenced to execution, right? Here, the government representative intervenes and says, "Objection, Your Honor." The judge says, "Objection overruled. Continue." LaRue says, "I don't know the laws related to that case. I cannot answer that question." In my opinion, the answer he gives is a carefully rehearsed one. He says, "The only thing they told me is that they will tell the court that I am a truthful person and that the information I gave them was a great help to them." But he says that when I decided to cooperate, the only charge I was facing was planning to smuggle crystal meth, meaning the deal he had gone to Liberia for. And the potential punishment for such a thing could be, for example, from 10 years to life imprisonment, but it probably has a light sentence. LaRue himself says that the sentence proposed to him was 12 years. Then Richmond asks him, "Why should such a relatively light sentence encourage you to cooperate?" This part of the conversation is very interesting. I will translate his question sentence by sentence as he reads it. "You knew that your legal situation was far worse than a crystal meth smuggling case, right?" His first question, naturally, asks about LaRue's profession. Ratliff says LaRue paused for a long time and said, "Basically, I've been programming for years." It's an interesting answer and not entirely wrong. Over the next hour, Paul was forced, for the first time and perhaps the last time, to publicly answer a series of questions about his almost 10 years of criminal activity. Richmond, very coolly, very eagerly, sometimes with a touch of humor, barrages him with questions. LaRue leans on the chair, arms crossed, only bending forward toward the microphone when he wants to answer, and gives very short answers to Richmond's questions in a polite but cold tone. What this hearing provided for Ratliff was that it once again confirmed the findings of his long investigation. LaRue confirmed that he wrote the E4M software, but denied being behind the TrueCrypt software. He said, "No, that's not the case." He accepted several of his fake names, including Johann Smith and Bernard Bolins, John Smith, and also confessed to arranging the smuggling of a 200-ton cocaine shipment from Ecuador with that fishing boat. He says he confirmed in a very calm tone that, besides those two Filipino women, he also ordered the murder of David Smith. Of course, the judge did not allow Richmond to ask whether the method of David Smith's murder was the same as what we had heard before, or if he was killed in another way. But later, a policeman told Ratliff another version of Smith's killing, which is interesting to hear. He said that they didn't put Smith in a grave. They took him by boat to the middle of the water, threw him in, and shot him. LaRue himself shot the floating corpse several times. In fact, it was a repetition of the same scene that David Smith himself had arranged for Moran Oz. Then Richmond goes to the story of LaRue's cooperation with the police and looks for a sign or evidence to show that he was told, for example, that if he didn't cooperate, he would be sentenced to execution. He says, "How so?" He says, "Well, for example, you ordered several murders, right?" Richmond asks, "So you don't know that in America, a person can be sentenced to execution for murder?" Up to this point, it seems that Richmond has achieved his goal and has been able to bring LaRue into the public eye and show him to the world. Oz's trial is in October, meaning this October, and whenever we have news about it, we will naturally publish it through the channel NARRA blog and say what's what. In paragraph 4, it is written that from 2009 to September 2012, Paul LaRue in various ways exported technology equipment and technical services from the United States to Iran and to the Iranian government. The two policemen who spoke with Ratliff under the aliases JD and Soul later separately confirmed that LaRue claimed to have sold missile guidance systems to Iran. Ratliff puts this piece of information alongside other pieces he had heard from former LaRue employees that yes, and of course this very work of report writing and fact-checking and verification has made it very, very difficult for Ratliff and his colleagues. If you listen to Ratliff's interviews about this report here and there, including Peter Gotti, John Gotti's brother, who is accused of trying to kill Gravano. This is a very famous and very interesting case in the New York Mafia world. Its subject is outside the scope of this story, so we won't go into it, just a very, very brief mention that Gravano, whom we said Peter was accused of trying to kill, was one of Gotti's men. Gotti was one of New York's biggest gangsters, the head of the large Gambino family, and this was one of his men who cooperated with the police to finally bring him to court. This person himself and his stories and adventures are very interesting for those who like mafia stories, especially Italian-American or New York families, and have seen similar ones in the Sopranos series or the Godfather movie. This lawyer, in short, was Peter's lawyer. Besides this, he is also often brought on Fox News, where he is also a familiar face. They bring him there as an expert, for example, and he talks about cases. Of course, this person ultimately does not interview with Ratliff about this case. He says nothing. You will see how much trouble such a problem creates. When your report is supposed to be published in a reputable place and every quote and claim must be verifiable, and for example, you can't just write anything. One of those programs common in America to protect witnesses in important cases, those who might be threatened because of their testimony and help to the police. The police protect them. It is also possible, of course, that he will be deported or start a new life or resume the life he had before in a different way. Officially, besides the gold they seized in Hong Kong, the D has only confiscated $36,000 of LaRue's assets in total. LaRue states in his testimony that this was the vast majority of his assets at the time of his arrest, a claim that almost no one can believe. Saul, Ratliff's source in the police, says that the D found a bank account with $8 million in it. But before the DA could go after it, it was emptied. Now, who emptied it is unknown. Saul says LaRue's plan is to serve 10 years in prison, then get out, and go after the millions of dollars he has stockpiled. Some also say that not only has LaRue hidden tens of millions of dollars in the Philippines, but the government and LaRue's former associates are racing to see who gets their hands on this money first. Reporting this story has become a very complicated task. A part of LaRue's case, but after this hearing, it has moved out of a confidential state. Now LaRue's fate is in the hands of the federal judge who must decide on his case. This judge, named Priska, is unlikely to issue a ruling before the outcome of other cases in which LaRue may be summoned as a witness is known. This judge will probably wait for the outcome of other cases in which LaRue may be summoned as a witness to be known, and then issue a ruling. Cases such as Moran Oz's case, the murder case of Catherine Lee, and these cases. Based on what happens in these courts and what happens from now until a few months from now, LaRue could have any future from 10 years in prison to life imprisonment. He had recently started new adventures in the Mediterranean and North Africa, including sending someone to Pakistan to gather information on arms sales and such things. And for example, they say that the judge can also consider those crimes in the final verdict he gives, but they cannot try him for them. If the case proceeds like the cases of other people who cooperated in this matter, probably a lawyer from the Department of Justice will come and ask for a reduction in his sentence because of his cooperation. This means there is a possibility that this person will ultimately receive a lighter sentence for the 7 murders. He himself confessed to ordering then his men for planning 2 imaginary murders. That is, ultimately, he becomes a person in the category of those famous criminals who secretly cooperated with the police, some of whose stories have even been made into interesting films. But of course, as LaRue himself rightly said in that hearing, there is no guarantee. And these police officers also say that when he said his subordinates would help catch him, He also promised the US government to give them information about his Iranian contacts. More information than this goes into classified information. Saul says, "I'm not even sure if this information from Roux was really useful to the Americans." His ambitious claim was that he was dealing directly with a general in the IRGC and that the Iranians were looking to expand missile technology for nuclear applications and such things. But Saul says if such a thing were true, it would be front-page news in all newspapers. Something that is very common among people in that space is that they generally see themselves as much bigger than they are, and sometimes they delude themselves. But this issue of Paul Sess' case is one of those parts that it seems we will hear more about from now on. The final and important question of the story is what the US government wants to do with Roux now. All of Roux' former associates who spoke with Ratliff for this report are thinking about the answer to this question, whether they are his call center managers in the Philippines, people in Israel, or those in Africa. And they are all afraid that one day he will somehow be released and come out, and with the billions of dollars he has hidden around the world, he will come after them. It is also out of fear of such a day that most of the people interviewed for this report wanted. Their names not to be mentioned, however, they cannot try him for any of the 7 murders. He confessed to ordering after his arrest, although the law is a bit complicated here. At the end of the report, Ratliff writes that finally, in the last days of writing this report, I managed to find the details of Roux' lawyer, Joseph de Benedetto, a famous lawyer living in Manhattan who has previously defended major famous criminals. If Roux is released, or perhaps it's better to say when Roux is released, he will probably be put in the Witness Protection Program, something for the people of the Philippines, and, for those who know, the story is very similar to the story of Yamashita's treasures. These are a collection of war spoils that a group of Japanese soldiers hid during World War II, in caves, tunnels, and underground facilities in the Philippines, and now for decades. Adventurers and treasure hunters from all over the world go to the Philippines hoping to find them. This brings us to another question that Ratliff has in his mind, and that is, what was Roux really after? Then Ratliff says that if we accept this, it means that I myself was also a part of Roux' plan. He says, 2 months ago, I went to see one of Roux' former employees in Israel. He says, I tried very hard to convince him to talk to me. He was a person who had completely separated from the organization and is now doing unrelated work. His name is not mentioned in this RX Limited case, although he worked in the call centers and was an important person, and it seems he is not in danger. No one is looking for him, although he himself says that he won't go to America for a long time so that he doesn't get into trouble. Ratliff says, I asked him what Roux was after. He said he wanted to be the biggest person ever arrested. He says, when I said goodbye to him, he said, what's important is that he will be caught and will face the consequences of his actions. Then he says, he leaned over the table and pointed to my notebook and said, if you publish this report, it means he has achieved his wish. And I, who am talking to you, am doing what he wanted. He wanted the story to be heard, and it is happening. This is also one of the most important questions that comes to mind for people. I, Ali Bandari, produced the Channel NARRA podcast with the help of Namlik, me. Thank you very much for introducing Channel NARRA to new people. During the time Mastermind was broadcast, Channel NARRA's audience increased. Please continue this work and introduce Channel NARRA to others if you like it. Another very nice thing you can do if you have an Apple ID is to rate the Channel NARRA podcast on iTunes. Give it a rating there, praise it if you like, and leave a positive comment. This helps the podcast be seen more. Follow the Channel NARRA podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Telegram with the ID Channel NARRA podcast to be informed of new episodes and also receive some pictures. Documents marginal and supplementary. Materials about the Mastermind story and stories that have been told before on Channel NARRA podcast. It has almost every week that one or two interesting news items about one of the subjects we've had before are published. And usually, when this news comes out with a few days delay, with the help of the volunteers who cooperate with the channel NARRA blog, we translate it and put it on the blog. If you follow channel NARRA on any of the places I mentioned, you will automatically be informed of new blog posts. After Mastermind, we no longer have a serial podcast. We return to the routine we had before, a new story each time. And now let's see what the first one will be, but it won't take too long. Channel NARRA Podcast. Some of his associates also say that he was passionate about money, fascinated by the power that money gives him, and madly enjoyed the fact that so much money was flowing towards him that he couldn't even spend it. Some also say his motivation came from a deeper place, as if all his actions had a motive of revenge. Then they look at his childhood or his reaction to being tortured. Ratliff himself says, "I always think a part of this story goes back to this person's being a programmer, to his coding. It is about him being immersed in the world of coding, because there he could shape reality the way he wanted," he says. "I think he was trying to apply the logic of programming to the real world as well. That's why the DES plan was as attractive to him as his own business plans. His perspective was always from the angle of an algorithm, not morality." But he says, "Lulu's words about notoriety have stayed in my head. Maybe this wasn't what he wanted from the beginning, but after a while, for example, he became attached to it. And everyone has returned empty-handed so far, and it's a very interesting story in itself, which again is outside the adventures of this case, but it's a very strange thing in the Philippines. Now LaRoux's treasures have also met a fate similar to Yamashita's treasures. Besides the gold, many of LaRoux's former employees say he also hid a lot of cash with which he can easily rebuild his empire. Lulu, one of those who believes LaRoux will definitely come after him when he gets out of prison, says, "I don't think the time he spent working with law enforcement has changed this person." He says, "He was passionate about what he did. He wanted to be the biggest person, and such a person never gets these things out of his head." This was a person who was desperately seeking notoriety and scandal. LaRoux finally always knew that one day they would catch him. The software he wrote finally has an output. Everything he designed comes to a conclusion. What you heard was the last episode of the Mastermind serial podcast from channel NARRA.